Winter, 1942. Eastern Poland. A place that had ceased to be a place and had become something else entirely. A repository for the forgotten. The prisoner of war camp sat like a wound in the frozen landscape, barbed wire tracing geometric patterns against gray sky. Snow fell without sound, gathering in the corners of wooden barracks and along the edges of guard towers. Inside the wire, Soviet soldiers moved like shadows, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had once been men. This was Stalag 319, one of hundreds of camps scattered across territories the Wehrmacht had seized and could not digest. The ground was hard, the bread was sawdust mixed with flour. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the peculiar metallic odor that comes from places where hope has been carefully extracted. Among the prisoners was Dmitri Volkov, a former schoolteacher from Kursk, who had been conscripted in 1941. He was 26 years old, though the cold and hunger had aged him beyond recognition. His hands, which had once held chalk and graded children's essays, now shook when he tried to light the stub of a cigarette traded for half a day's ration. He did not speak much. None of them did. Words required energy they could not afford. Dmitri had been captured during the catastrophic encirclement at Vyazma in October 1941, when entire Soviet armies simply evaporated under German fire. He remembered the surrender, the shame of it, the relief, the animal instinct to survive overriding everything his commissars had drilled into him about never being taken alive. The march westward had been worse than battle. Men dropped and were shot. Others kept walking until they collapsed and died in the mud. Dmitri survived by becoming small, invisible, conserving every scrap of warmth and energy. By the time they reached Stalag 319, he had learned the first rule of captivity: do not be noticed. The guards were a mixture of Wehrmacht soldiers and older men deemed unfit for frontline duty. Most treated the prisoners with the casual cruelty of farmers managing livestock. A few were worse, finding in their authority over starving men a kind of power they had never possessed in civilian life. But there was one guard who was different. His name was Klaus Eberhardt, 32 years old, from a small town near Stuttgart. He had been a postal clerk before the war, a quiet man who loved classical music and spent his evenings reading Thomas Mann. The war had found him the way it found everyone, pulling him from his orderly life and depositing him into this frozen limbo, where he stood watch over men he had been taught to despise but could not quite manage to hate. Klaus walked the perimeter each morning, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He was thin, like everyone else, though not starving. His uniform was clean but threadbare. He carried a rifle he had never fired at a human being and prayed he never would. Sometimes, when no other guards were watching, he would leave small things near the barracks door: a crust of bread wrapped in paper, a cigarette, once a pair of wool socks. These gestures were dangerous. If discovered, they would mean reassignment, possibly worse. But Klaus could not stop himself. He had been raised by a mother who quoted scripture, and a father who had been a socialist before the Nazis made such things impossible to speak aloud. Klaus had learned to hide his thoughts, to perform the rituals of loyalty while keeping a part of himself locked away. In the camp, surrounded by suffering, that hidden part of him ached. Dmitri noticed the small gifts. At first he assumed they were traps, that accepting them would lead to interrogation or punishment. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. The bread appeared, the cigarettes came, and Klaus, during his rounds, would sometimes pause by the wire, looking not at the prisoners, but past them, toward the tree line, as if he too were imprisoned. One morning in December, when the cold had turned the world into iron, Dmitri found a piece of paper tucked beneath a stone near the latrine. It was a page torn from a book, Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. The text was in German, which Dmitri could read haltingly, having studied it in university before the war devoured such pursuits. He stood in the snow holding the page, feeling the texture of the paper between his fingers. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt like a window opening in a sealed room. He looked up and saw Klaus watching him from the guard tower. Their eyes met for only a second. Then Klaus looked away. That night, Dmitri began to write. He had no proper paper, no pen, but he had bark stripped from a firewood log and a piece of charcoal salvaged from the stove. He wrote in Russian first, then tried to translate it clumsily into German, his fingers stiff from cold. Thank you for the bread. Thank you for the socks. Thank you for the words. It was not poetry. It was barely coherent, but it was something real. The next morning, he folded the bark and hid it beneath the same stone where he had found Rilke's page. He did not know if Klaus would find it. He did not even know if Klaus could read Russian. But the act of writing, the shaping of thought into language, the belief that someone might receive it, felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. 3 days later, there was a response. Klaus had written on the back of a requisition form, in careful script, "I am glad the gifts helped. I should not write this, but I am glad." Dmitri held the paper as if it were made of glass. The simplicity of the words, the admission of risk, the acknowledgement of human connection despite every rule designed to prevent it, cut through him. He wrote back that night. This time, he tried harder with the German. "I was a teacher before. I taught children to read. Now I am forgetting how to feel human. Your gifts remind me." The correspondence became a rhythm, secret and fragile. They never spoke face to face. Klaus could not risk being seen in conversation with a prisoner. But the letters grew longer, more honest. Klaus wrote about his life before the war, the smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, the first time he heard Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and felt something larger than himself. He wrote about his fear that the war had turned him into someone unrecognizable. Dmitri wrote about teaching, about the way children's faces lit up when they understood a difficult concept. He wrote about his wife, Katya, and their small apartment in Kursk. He wrote about the last time he had felt clean, truly clean, and how much he missed that simple dignity. These were not love letters in the romantic sense. They were something stranger and more profound, an insistence on mutual humanity in a place designed to erase it. By early 1943, they had developed a system. Dmitri would leave his letter hidden near a loose plank in the latrine wall. Klaus would retrieve it during his night patrol and leave his own response in the same location. The risk was enormous. Discovery meant execution for Dmitri and court-martial for Klaus. Yet they continued. Other prisoners began to notice Dmitri's behavior, the way he sometimes smiled to himself, the way he seemed less hollow than the others. A fellow prisoner, Grigory, confronted him one night in the barracks. "You are too calm," Grigory said, his voice sharp with suspicion. "What do you have that the rest of us do not?" Dmitri said nothing, but Grigory watched him, and eventually Grigory followed him. When Grigory discovered the letters, he was furious. "You are collaborating," Grigory hissed. "You are betraying us for scraps." Dmitri shook his head. "I am surviving. And he is not what you think. He is a Nazi. He is a man." The argument nearly came to blows, but Grigory, despite his anger, kept the secret. Perhaps because he understood, on some level, that in a place where everything human had been stripped away, even a dangerous kindness was worth protecting. Klaus, on his side of the wire, faced his own reckoning. Another guard, a fervent party member named Richter, had begun watching him with suspicion. Richter had noticed Klaus's long patrols near the latrine, the way he sometimes paused too long by the fence. One night, Richter confronted him. "You are soft on the Ivans," Richter said, his voice cold. "I am doing my duty," Klaus replied. "You're doing more than that. I see you. You think they are your friends, but they are animals. And when this is over, you will be judged by the company you keep." Klaus said nothing, but he knew Richter was dangerous. He knew the correspondence had to stop. And yet, the next night, he left another letter. Spring came slowly, grudgingly, to Stalag 319. The snow melted into mud, and the mud turned the camp into a quagmire. Disease spread. Men died quietly in the night, their bodies carried out at dawn and buried in unmarked pits beyond the wire. Dmitri grew weaker. The rations had been cut again. His hands shook constantly now, and he could not keep warm no matter how many layers he wrapped around himself. But the letters continued. They had become his tether to something beyond survival, a reminder that thought and feeling still existed, that the world was not entirely reduced to hunger and fear. Klaus wrote to him about music, describing symphonies Dmitri had never heard, trying to convey through words what sound felt like. Dmitri wrote back about poetry, reciting lines from Pushkin and Lermontov, translating them as best he could. They began to call each other by name. Klaus signed his letters K. Dmitri signed his D. The intimacy of it was startling. In another world, they might have been friends, two men who loved books and beauty, who believed in something beyond the brutality of nations at war. But in this world, they were prisoner and guard, enemies bound by a secret correspondence that grew more dangerous with each passing week. Richter had not stopped watching. He began conducting surprise inspections, searching barracks, interrogating prisoners. He was hunting for something, and Klaus knew what it was. One night in April, Klaus wrote what he thought might be his final letter. "They are watching me. I think they suspect. If this is the last you hear from me, know that writing to you was the only thing in this war that made me feel human. I will remember you when this is over." Dmitri received the letter and felt something break inside him. Not despair, exactly. Something closer to grief. The recognition that even this fragile connection, this tiny act of resistance against the machinery of war, could not survive. He wrote back immediately, his hand shaking, his German barely legible. "You have saved me. Not my body. My body is already lost. But you have saved the part of me that remembers how to care. That is enough. That is everything." He hid the letter in the usual place and returned to the barracks, where he lay on his bunk and wept silently in the dark. But Klaus never retrieved the letter. The next morning, Richter conducted a raid. He had finally gathered enough suspicion to act. He searched the latrine area with methodical precision. And when he found Dmitri's letter hidden in the wall, he read it slowly, his face hardening. Klaus was arrested within the hour. Dmitri, watching from the barracks window, saw Klaus being led away by two SS officers, his hands bound. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the yard. Klaus did not look angry or afraid. He looked almost relieved. Dmitri never saw him again. Klaus was taken to a military prison in Łódź. The charges were collaboration with the enemy, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming a German soldier. The letters were presented as evidence, each one read aloud in a cold courtroom while Klaus sat silent. The prosecutor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, spoke with disgust about Klaus's betrayal. He called the letters obscene, a perversion of German values. He suggested that Klaus harbored communist sympathies, perhaps even deeper psychological abnormalities. Klaus said nothing in his defense. He could have claimed the letters were part of an intelligence operation, a ruse to gain information from prisoners. He could have disavowed every word, but he refused. "I wrote them because I am human," he said finally when asked to explain himself. And he was human. That is all. The judges were not moved. They sentenced him to death. The execution was scheduled for May 15, 1943. Klaus was to be shot by firing squad, his body buried in an unmarked grave, his name stricken from military records. But the war was moving faster than paperwork. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, resources were scarce, and bureaucratic delays were common. Klaus sat in his cell for weeks, then months, as the execution date was repeatedly postponed. He spent his time writing, not to Dmitri, whom he assumed was dead or lost in the churn of camp transfers, but to himself. He wrote about his childhood, about the books he had loved, about the small kindnesses his mother had shown to strangers. He wrote to fill the silence, to keep himself from disappearing. Meanwhile, at Stalag 319, Dmitri was dying. The dysentery that had swept through the camp in late spring had left him skeletal. He could barely walk. Grigory, the prisoner who had once accused him of collaboration, now helped him to the latrine, carried water to his bunk, shared what little food he could spare. "Why are you helping me?" Dmitri asked one night, his voice a whisper. "Because you reminded me that we are still men," Grigory said. "Even here." Dmitri closed his eyes. He thought of Klaus, wondered where he was, whether he was still alive. He imagined him reading under a tree somewhere, free from all of this. He never learned the truth. January 1945. The Red Army was pushing westward, sweeping across Poland like a wave of iron and fury. The Germans, retreating in chaos, began evacuating camps, forcing prisoners on death marches through the winter cold. Dmitri was among those marched west. He barely survived the first 3 days. On the fourth day, the column was strafed by Soviet planes. Men scattered into the woods. Dmitri, too weak to run, lay in the snow and waited to die. A German medic found him instead. The medic, a conscripted Austrian, not much older than 20, carried Dmitri to a farmhouse and left him with a Polish family who had been hiding refugees. The family fed Dmitri broth, kept him warm, and did not ask questions. When the Red Army arrived a week later, Dmitri was still barely alive. Soviet soldiers found him in the farmhouse and transported him to a field hospital. He spent 2 months recovering, his body slowly remembering what it meant to eat, to sleep without fear. But recovery was not freedom. The Soviet state did not welcome back its prisoners of war. They were suspect, potential traitors, who had allowed themselves to be captured rather than die fighting. Dmitri was interrogated, his story examined for signs of collaboration. He said nothing about the letters. He could not risk mentioning Klaus, could not bear to have those words, those small acts of humanity, twisted into something shameful. In April 1945, he was cleared of wrongdoing but banned from returning to his teaching post. He was sent to work in a factory in the Urals, far from his wife, far from everything he had known. Klaus, meanwhile, was still in prison. The execution order had been lost in the collapse of German administration. As the Allies closed in, the prison was evacuated. Klaus, along with other condemned men, was placed on a train heading south. The train never reached its destination. It was bombed by American planes near Dresden. Klaus survived the attack but escaped in the chaos. He walked west, shedding his uniform, becoming a refugee among millions. He crossed into American-occupied Germany in May 1945, just days after the surrender. He told the Americans he had been a postal clerk, which was true. He said nothing about the camp, the letters, or Dmitri. He was processed, given a new identity card, and released. He returned to Stuttgart and found his mother's house still standing. Though much of the city was rubble, she wept when she saw him, held him as if he were still a child. Klaus went back to work at the post office. He married in 1947, had 2 children, lived quietly. He never spoke about the war, but he kept the letters. 1962, Moscow. Dmitri Volkov was 52 years old. He worked in a textile factory, lived in a communal apartment with 2 other families, and spent his evenings reading books borrowed from the state library. His wife, Katya, had divorced him in 1950, unable to endure the silence and distance that had settled over him after the war. He had no children. He had no close friends. He had survived, but survival was not the same as living. One autumn evening, a letter arrived. It was forwarded through a circuitous route, first to the Ministry of Education, then to the factory where he worked, then finally to his apartment. The return address was Stuttgart, West Germany. Dmitri's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single page, written in the same careful script he had last seen in 1943. Dear D, I do not know if this will reach you. I do not know if you are alive. But I've kept your letters all these years, and I wanted you to know that they saved me too. You reminded me that even in the darkest places, there is still kindness. I hope you found peace. K. Dmitri sat at his small kitchen table and read the letter 5 times. Then he wept, not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming relief of being remembered. He wrote back immediately. The letter took 6 weeks to reach Stuttgart, passing through layers of Cold War bureaucracy and suspicion. But it arrived. Klaus, receiving it, stood in his kitchen and held the paper to the light, as if checking for some sign that it was real. They began corresponding again. This time, the letters were different. They were no longer desperate acts of survival, but reflections on what they had been through, what it had meant. Klaus wrote about guilt, about the weight of having stood by while others suffered. Dmitri wrote about anger, about the system that had punished him for surviving. They wrote about forgiveness, though neither could quite articulate what that meant. Over the years, the letters became a bridge between 2 men who had been shaped by the same catastrophe but lived in worlds that could not formally acknowledge each other. They discussed books, philosophy, the slow process of aging. They never met in person. The Cold War made that impossible, but they continued writing until Klaus died in 1978. His wife, clearing out his study, found a box containing 63 letters written in Russian, along with Klaus's own replies, carefully dated and preserved. She did not understand what they were, but she knew they were important. She contacted the German Red Cross, who eventually traced Dmitri through Soviet emigration records. The letters were returned to him in 1979, accompanied by a note from Klaus's widow. He spoke of you sometimes, though he did not tell me the full story. I think these belong to you. Dmitri, now 71, sat in his apartment and read through the letters, his and Klaus's, the entire correspondence from beginning to end. He read through the night, and by morning, he had decided. 1983. A small museum in West Berlin dedicated to documenting personal histories of the Second World War. Dmitri had donated the letters. He had also written a short memoir explaining the context, the risk, the unlikely connection that had formed across barbed wire. The museum curator, a young historian named Anna, was moved by the story. She asked if she could publish excerpts. Dmitri hesitated, then he agreed. The letters were published in a scholarly journal first, then excerpted in a German newspaper. The response was overwhelming. People wrote to the museum sharing similar stories, small acts of kindness in impossible places, connections that had defied the logic of war. Some accused Dmitri of fabrication, of softening history to serve a political narrative. Others accused Klaus of being complicit in atrocities simply by virtue of his position. But most people simply read the letters and felt something shift. A recognition that even in systems designed to dehumanize, individual human beings could still choose differently. Dmitri was invited to speak at the museum. He was 81 years old, frail but still sharp. He stood before an audience of Germans and Russians, of young people who had never known war, and he spoke quietly. I do not tell this story to say the war was not terrible, he said. It was terrible. It destroyed millions, but I tell it because Klaus and I refused to let it destroy everything. We insisted on remaining human. That was our resistance. Someone in the audience asked if he had forgiven Klaus for being part of the system that imprisoned him. Dmitri paused. I do not know if forgiveness is the right word, he said. Klaus did not ask for it, but I am grateful to him. He helped me survive, not by changing my circumstances, but by reminding me who I was. After the talk, an elderly German woman approached him. She had tears in her eyes. I was Klaus's daughter, she said. I never knew this story. My father never told us. Dmitri took her hand. They stood together in silence, two people bound by a history they had not chosen but could now finally acknowledge. Dmitri Volkov died in 1989. Zichit Kwiwer Arbaviwa over 9, 6 months before the Berlin Wall fell. He did not live to see the Cold War end, did not see the borders that had separated him from Klaus dissolve, but the letters survived. They are now housed in the State Museum of Modern History in Moscow, alongside other documents from the war. School children visit and read them, their teachers explaining the historical context, the risks both men took. Some students find the story inspiring. Others find it sad. A few are confused. They cannot understand why a Soviet soldier would write to a Nazi guard, why such a connection would matter. But the letters remain. Klaus's family, after initial hesitation, allowed his side of the correspondence to be displayed alongside Dmitri's. The two sets of letters, written in two languages across decades of silence, are now read together. In 2015, a German filmmaker made a documentary about the story. It was shown at the Berlinale and won a prize for historical documentary. The film ends with a shot of the letters under glass, the ink fading but still legible, and a voiceover reading Klaus's final letter to Dmitri, written in 1976. We were supposed to be enemies, but we became something else. I do not know what to call it, but it was real, and it mattered. The screen fades to black, and the only sound is silence. On a quiet street in Stuttgart, Klaus Eberhardt's grandchildren sometimes visit his grave. They bring flowers. They stand for a moment, thinking about a man they barely knew. trying to understand a war that feels impossibly distant. And in Moscow, in a small apartment near the university, a scholar named Victor is working on a book about wartime correspondence. He has read Dmitri and Klaus's letters dozens of times, has analyzed their language, their shifts in tone, the way danger and tenderness coexisted in their words. Victor does not believe in simple narratives. He knows that Klaus's act of kindness did not undo the system he served. He knows that Dmitri's survival did not erase the millions who did not survive. But he also knows this. In a world organized around hatred, two men chose otherwise. They wrote letters. They acknowledged each other's humanity. They refused the story they were supposed to live, and in doing so, they left something behind. Not a lesson, not a moral, but a question that lingers still. What if more people had made the same choice? The question has no answer, but the letters remain, preserved under glass, waiting to be read by people who have never known barbed wire, never felt the cold of a prisoner of war camp, never had to decide whether a small act of kindness is worth risking everything. The letters remain, and perhaps that is enough.